Vlad the Impaler, even his name sounds downright sinister. As one of the most reviled figures in history, he is remembered as a bloodthirsty tyrant. His love of impaling people has earned him a dark place in the public's imagination. Claims that he was the real-life inspiration for Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, the undead nobleman who, like Vlad, loved to poke holes in people, have only added to the fascination. But who was Vlad the Impaler, really? One of the cruelest rulers in history. He was born around 1430 as a prince of Wallachia, a principality in what is today Romania. Vlad Tepes came of age in a turbulent time. The aggressive, expanding Ottoman Empire was setting its sights on Eastern Europe after successfully conquering Constantinople in 1453. Vlad, a young ruler struggling to simply hold onto the throne he inherited, was thrust into the role of defender of his lands against the aggression of a much bigger army. He also had enemies closer to home, and even went into conflict against Saxons. Though this may sound like a feel-good underdog story, Vlad's tactics made it a darker, more complicated one. His campaigns against the Ottomans, Saxons, and other rivals were forged in blood. Lots of it. He used gruesome and sinister tactics to do whatever he could to preserve his authority in an unstable world. But since the stories about him came mainly from his enemies, hard facts about Vlad the Impaler are a little difficult to come by. Whether or not totally true, however, Vlad's bloody axe contributed to the legend of the Impaler and cast a dark shadow even to this day. Vlad's youth was spent in the heart of the Ottoman Empire as a hostage. As a result of the conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Vlad's home of Wallachia, the teenage prince and his younger brother Radu were taken to the Sultan Murad II as hostages. As long as their father, the king of Wallachia, didn't resist the Ottomans, they would be fine. Murad spared their lives and eventually released the Wallachian princes. Though Vlad's time as a hostage may have developed his bloodlust, it didn't seem to bother his younger brother in the slightest. In fact, young Radu seemed to have made the most of his life in captivity. He befriended many Ottomans and even converted to Islam. When the newly free young prince returned to Wallachia in 1448, he was not quite the homecoming he expected. Both his father and older brother and heir to the throne had been assassinated by Wallachian nobles. Vlad was next in line for the throne, but he had to fight to keep it. After being deposed and forced into exile, he regained the throne again in 1456. With his new rule came a new form of frenzied bloodlust. Most of his atrocities date from this period. Perhaps the climax of Vlad's penchant for impaling came in 1462. After fleeing an Ottoman advance, Vlad left a so-called Forest of the Impaled in his wake. According to accounts, no less than 20,000 prisoners of war had been impaled, their bodies decaying on the spikes. Whether or not 20,000 people were actually impaled remains debatable, but Vlad, nonetheless, built a chilling reputation for using gruesome war tactics. Impaling human beings on huge spikes wasn't just to punish them. Vlad knew the horrific spectacle had other uses. Part of the reason Vlad impaled people was that it would put the fear of God into spectators. Impalement was used as a deterrent. Well, deterrent might be too light a word for it. Some claim that Vlad's use of impalement was actually an early form of terrorism. Perhaps one of the cruelest stories in the vast repertoire of Vlad the Impaler tales involves his biggest enemies, the Ottomans. The Sultan had sent a group of his men to meet with Vlad. When they were presented to the ruler of Wallachia, they did not remove their turbans. It was nothing personal, they claimed, just a religious custom. Vlad was not pleased. He declared he would help them keep their turbans secure, and he did so by nailing them to their heads. Thanks to his terrifying tactics, gruesome stories began to circulate about Vlad's supposed bloodlust. Impaling people was bad enough, but these stories implied he had actually had, well, a thing for blood. One text, for example, relished in pointing out Vlad's depravities. Among the list of complaints, he washed his hands in the blood of his victims. Vlad wasn't only antagonistic towards the Ottomans, parts of Transylvania were also vulnerable to his wrath. He even targeted civilians. Not only did he employ scorched earth policies and poison village wells, but he also impaled men, women, and according to some, even children. One account even claimed Vlad impaled babies on their mothers' breasts. Among Vlad's diverse repertoire of battle tactics was a technique pretty novel for the period he operated in: biological warfare. In his campaign against the Ottomans, he felt it might be easier to defeat an ill army than a healthy one, so he thought outside the box. Vlad actually paid sick people to go to the Ottoman camps in the hopes they would spread their disease and cause an epidemic. Vlad employed guerrilla tactics in order to hold off the giant Ottoman army. One night in 1462, Vlad led his army on a quick surprise attack on the Ottoman camp in the hopes of assassinating the Sultan. Vlad's men needed to sneak into the camp, and so they dressed up in Ottoman clothes. Though the attack ended in a retreat for Vlad, it caused enough chaos that the Ottomans began killing one another, unsure who the real enemy was. Vlad may have violated the ancient laws of hospitality. One legend claims that Vlad disposed of some of his early enemies in a particularly brutal and devious fashion. It would be a mistake to assume that Vlad's brutal tactics were limited to impaling. He used another method of torture, which was just as disturbing. According to one story, he actually boiled his enemies alive. To be fair, Vlad was far from the only individual in history to practice death by boiling. When considered alongside his other supposed crimes, it all adds up to a chilling or blistering picture. In the centuries following Vlad's death on the battlefield in the 1470s, his legacy has been mostly revered, not reviled. To some, Vlad was the people's prince who fought to save them from the Ottomans. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, when Europe was stirring with nationalist movements, Vlad was actually embraced as a national hero in Romania. It wasn't until after the popularization of vampire mythology and the presumed connection between Count Dracula and Vlad that he became a villain in history.